All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Thought Bubble 2020, and thanks for tuning into this virtual Hilda panel. My name is Bryan Korn. I'm series producer on the Hilda animated series. The first season of Hilda premiered in 2018 on Netflix, and we're very excited to share the second season in almost 1 month's time in December. Welcome, and I have the enormous pleasure of being joined by Luke Pearson, the comic book artist, writer, illustrator who created the Hilda series of graphic novels and serves as creator, executive producer, writer of the animated series. So welcome, Luke.
Thank you, Bryan. That was a very nice introduction.
Thank you very much. I spent hours scripting it. So now we're going to go off script, and I thought that this could be an opportunity. So I work on the show, you work on the show. We've been working together on this thing for what feels like many years, because it is many years. I think this is an opportunity to kind of. I think we started like 20. I think if we first met in like 2015. No. Even earlier. I think maybe 2014. That's actually maybe a good place to start, which is how this show came to be. So I'm sure a lot of our listeners are either artists, writers, comic artists of their own that are maybe interested in seeing their works adapted. How did we get connected?
Well, from my point of view, I just received a book in the post, which was a book that looked like one of the books that Hilda has in her satchel in Hilda and the Bird Parade. And it was like a kind of a conversion. It was like a real version of that book that had a Trollberg library card inside it. And I opened it up, and it had like a little message, and there's the book. And there's the real book. Yeah, it had a little wooden USB stick in there describing what you guys were pitching, I guess. There was a little elf letter, and it kind of had a little Silvergate show reel, so I knew what you were all about. And yeah, I feel like maybe there was a follow-up email or something, so it wasn't entirely mysterious.
So before this little indie production company named Silvergate Media reached out to you, you had published 3 books in the Hilda series and were working on a 4th. So that's really how we came across Hilda. Was that one of our producers, Kurt Mueller, found at an indie bookstore in Brooklyn, found the Hilda Folk book, which had maybe just kind of come to America at that point, that No Brow published, and brought it in, and we fell in love with it, and we got all 3 books, and we shared it around the office, and we said, this is the kind of, as an animation production company, this is exactly the kind of thing that we wanted to be working on, because it's like a kick-ass girl at the front of fantasy adventure stories that feel just kind of true and like deeply emotionally grounded. And so we went after it and sent you a fan letter. And we approached you and sent you this pitch, and then before you said yes, hey, I want to make the show with these guys, what was that thought process like? Had you thought about adaptation? I know that you've done some work in animation before.
Yeah. well, I hadn't really done that much work in animation. I think around that time, I had done I did a few storyboards for Adventure Time, but they were fairly like one-off type affairs. And for Hilda, like I hadn't seriously considered adaptation early on. It was I think maybe like before I even started the comics, when I was kind of drawing the character, I kind of had an idea, like I could see it as an animated series, but at that point I didn't know. The path to that seemed so vague and far off that it wasn't a serious consideration. And around the time I heard from you guys, there had been like talks and discussions and some interest about Hilda prior to that, but nothing had. They were all a little bit off, and nothing had been agreed to, basically. And when this came through, I had an immediate kind of positive reaction, just because, I didn't know exactly what you wanted to do with the show or how it would turn out, but the fact that you kind of there was obviously like an interest in the details of what I'd done, and it felt like at the very least, if you liked that, then I should be able to sway the thing in the direction I'd like it to go in. If you were that interested in the nitty gritty of what I'd put down, so yeah, I was hopeful.
Can you share any like broad details about the pitches you might have gotten for animation before? Not to sling mud, but I think the listeners might be curious, like what was off potentially about those previous approaches.
Well, there was just there was only a couple, and not many like really got to the point where I really knew how it would go. But there's certainly, it seemed like certain people were more interested in taking kind of the general idea of Hilda, taking the character, or kind of like skewing it in ways that didn't really interest me, and kind of changing quite fundamental things about it, and maybe only leaving the kind of outer shell what it would be. And I was feeling kind of a bit cold about that. Yeah.
Well, I think it's a great takeaway for content creators out there. It's we felt the opposite, which was that there was such this fully realized world over the course of these 3 books that it was just like great bedrock for us to build all the crazy complex things you have to create to make a series. So the series was at a tipping point at that point. You had done all of this work, spent years on these stories and characters, and that gave us a really like strong entry point. So once we started working together on the pitch for the series, what were kind of the key pieces of Hilda that you felt really strongly about carrying over from the comics to the television series?
I think I was fairly like open to it, but like I wanted to keep the general logic of the world. I mean, obviously, ideally, I wanted to keep everything the same. Like that was my gut feeling. Is like, well, I've put the work in. I've gone through all these thought processes myself. I've figured out all these characters myself. I spent a long time figuring out how they all click together. So one of my desires was to not unpick that for the sake of it being animated, and I didn't feel like it had to be. And I wanted to keep the general feel of the comics, as vague as that is. But I had a feeling, I had a sort of vague concern that it could become too TV and too I don't know, formulaic or something. That was my like impression, having never gone through the process before of what might happen when you're making a TV show. So I wanted to make sure it's still kind of weird and a bit scary, and could be slow paced when it has to be, and yeah, I wanted to keep the kind of the logic of the world, where that I think is a little, I don't know, like keep the idea of these the kind of the fantastical and the the normal kind of living side by side in a kind of strange kind of way. Yeah.
And so that process, right, of taking what's there in the comic and kind of in a way expanding it, right? Because the first season is 13 stories, and by the time we started making it, there were 4 books. That process of adaptation, there was going to be some new material. So you worked with head writer Stephanie Simpson as we developed the series to kind of build out that world. And I'll share the cover of the Pitch Bible, which was kind of that key document where for broadcasters that we were pitching the show to, it kind of established the world of Hilda, but also talked about kind of what the show was, what the format was, what is different about this show than other shows. Can you talk a little bit about developments during this time that went beyond the books? The characters of David and Frida come to mind as characters that might have only had passing mentions in the books, but have become really key cast members.
Yeah, well, sorry. Yeah, well, I think kind of early on, that was it was Stephanie who kind of picked those characters out. I think she kind of was working on the early development stuff before I was kind of formally on board, and that was something that was kind of presented to me, I think, unless I'm remembering it wrong. But you know, David and Frida existed they kind of both appeared in Hilda and the Black Hound, and they weren't, they were maybe 2 of the more highlighted kids from the Sparrow Scout group, but they weren't created by me specifically to be Hilda's special friends. They're just kind of there, and I think Stephanie kind of saw the potential in them for various reasons, and kind of cast them as the human counterparts, because obviously in everything I've done, Hilda really only, apart from the Sparrow Scouts, she really just talks to animals and her mom, and there's only so far that can go, especially when you're wanting to kind of like keep the whole thing reined in to an extent, which is also something I'm always like looking to do, like not letting it slide completely like headfirst into the fantastical. So yeah, they were kind of like developed from very like small beginnings. David is just kind of like a gag character who has a bug on him, which is obviously something that ran into the series.
And do we know why David has a bug on him all the time? There are fan theories.
Not yet. We don't.
Too spicy for this interview. So that was kind of a key piece of this, like figuring out what the storytelling is for the series, and working with Stephanie on expanding character, thinking a little bit about what the arc of that first season might be, because I think we knew we wanted to adapt all the books, but we wanted to adapt them over the course of the season, kind of building to Black Hound. And once we get through the pitch, we can talk a little bit about how that kind of a collection of stories came together. But the other piece of the early series development was the look. And I think pretty early on, Mercury Filmworks, animation studio in Ottawa, came on, and we shared the books with them. And Premiere 2D Studio have done a lot of stuff with Disney, and they responded immediately and said, "We absolutely love these. We want to work on this." And the form that took in the early development was an animation test. And so I'll share a few images, early images, the first images from Mercury, that led to that test. But can you talk a little bit about what your interest was, what was exciting but also kind of scary about seeing Hilda move, and seeing her move into animation?
I think initially there wasn't really anything scary. I was just very excited to see what that would look like. I know I always had. I guess I always was bracing myself for someone to come and kind of totally redesign it, or kind of say the show is going to be in this totally different style. I was kind of always like waiting for that, and there was certainly like explorations into different styles. But that's also an interesting thing to talk about style as well, because it shifts so much, obviously, in my comics. And at this point, her model, like for this test, is very much like that's kind of how she looks in Bird Parade, and a bit like how she looks in the Black Hound. Like she's smaller than she is in the last two books. Like her legs are way skinnier. Their head is just like way bigger in relation to her body.
Definitely less of a suggestion of a neck.
Definitely. And in some ways, like I prefer her like that. Like I really like how she looks with like a massive head. But I think part of it to me was there was something I've always like struggled with the style of her, or maybe not struggled, but I'm always questioning it and changing my mind and trying to figure out what I think works better. But one of the big things is when she's tiny like that, it's kind of about what she looks like next to her mom, basically. Like I would always cheat it in the comics and just have her kind of off panel, but the way her mom is usually drawn, if she's that small, then she's a toddler, basically.
And Hilda's about 4 years old, right? I think that's what we've
Yeah.
agreed on.
Yeah.
So this is an image from Mercury, actually, that kind of charts as they were working on, hey, what should Hilda look like for the series? All the way on the left is what Hilda looked like in the animation test that Mercury ended up making. So Mercury produced, before we even had the series greenlit, Mercury produced about 1.5 minutes of animation, which I can't share with you now. I don't know. We haven't been able to share it for some reason. I think it's because there's an unlicensed music track in it. But I will share some images from it, because at this early stage from Mercury, so much of the way the show felt and moved. I mean, you'll see. Hilda looks very different here than she does in the series, but a lot of kind of those core elements and the color and the atmosphere, especially in this shot of Hilda's room, which is adapted directly from the end papers of one of the Hilda books. This image in particular was so key to us because it like the amount of detail and the suggestion of this like broader world. There's so much of Hilda's characters in this room and then on that desk. So that the 1.5 minutes of animation test was our opportunity to really try to like put some stakes in the ground visually around how we were going to adapt it. And this the final image of the animation test ended up inspiring the final image of the show open. So it should look familiar. But when we finished this test, we weren't done, right? Because we wanted to go on a further journey with Hilda's character, to see what she looks like. And Luke, you mentioned some of those explorations. I'll share them now, because I mean, and this is something I imagine artists do as well, is like Mercury wanted to turn over a bunch of stones to explore a bunch of really different things before they arrived on what Hilda should look like for the series. So here are a few of those exploratory roughs from different artists at Mercury. So here's super dynamic Hilda. Not too far from where we ended up.
No, I did really like that one. I think that's one where it's kind of like it looks cool, but it's also like, I mean, it's just really close. to what she kind of ended up being, actually.
Yeah, maybe a little older. I don't know. Yeah, she's
Yeah.
like a little taller. Maybe this is Hilda in a couple of years. Um, here's some explorations of Twig. This is really close to where Twig ended up. Here's another of Hilda. Super cute. Here's more of a stylized painterly Twig. It's really cute. I love this one. Totally different show.
Yeah, well, this is one of the ones where it's like I really like how it looks, but it felt like it's someone. I mean, that's literally what the exercise was, I imagine. But it's like it feels like her proportions and shapes have been pushed around, just kind of for the sake of it. I mean, I can see how it might be more. Maybe it would be more fun to animate. But it would be pushing the show in a visual direction. Just felt more kind of ordinarily cartoony.
Yeah, I'm interested in the lack of fingers on the medium shot. This is really cool. Like a slightly bit more realism. Still very cartoony. This is my favorite. This is this is a totally different Hilda. And I also like the idea that she just walks around barefoot all the time. But these were all really helpful explorations because they all helped us define what the boundaries were for this character, and helped us narrow down what she finally looked like. And this is the turnaround, which is kind of all the angles for animators reference for the final character. When we finally got into series development, I think this is a good. So we Netflix picked the series up, and then we had to develop all the rest of the characters in this way. And I'll share just one challenge I think that Mercury had in developing a character, which is David, who, as many viewers have noticed, doesn't have the same eyes style as David does, or as the rest of the characters do. Can you tell us why?
I can tell you why. Actually, I've got the thing here. David is actually based on this character. I can't see myself. I can't see if we can shot. Hang on. Here he is.
Here, I'll stop share.
This is the original David. This is a character that my girlfriend, Philippa Rice, made. He's been a loyal friend to me for a long time. He's called David, and he was kind of like my desk assistant for some years while I was working on the Hilda books. And the character David in the comics was meant to be like a humanized version of David. That's where David came from. And what I tried to do was to like draw his character with this same like jelly bean head shape. And I just changed his little like beak thing to be his nose. And I gave him a little face under there, and that was David. And I think maybe he was the first character in the comics to have dot eyes. There might be someone else.
Here's David's profile, just so you can see the resemblance.
There he is. I just did it because a lot of the time when I'm drawing the comics, I'll do things in there where I'm like, does this work? I don't know. I don't care because probably no one's gonna tell me to change it, so I'm just gonna do it, and hopefully it works. But I guess I was working on the logic of, like, you know, Barney Rubble, he's got dot eyes. Fred Flintstone does not have dot eyes. It's an established thing.
It works, and we do see other characters with dot eyes in the universe, and I think you will see some in season 2, and it'll all add up.
I think at some point we might have changed some character designs later on when we realized we need some more dots in there to kind of spread the idea that some people just have dots for eyes.
Well, that's a good segue into the building out the world visually with Mercury. And once we got into production and started working on the stories, there were new characters, but also the whole city of Trollberg needed to be populated. Especially for the third episode for Bird Parade, where Hilda has moved to the city and there's just a massive parade full of Trollbergians. And I want to share this sketch that you did. So a lot of the original designs, many of the key original designs for the series, you did preliminary sketches for, and then Mercury adapted. So when it came time for us to populate the world of Hilda, you did these sketches of characters, some with dot eyes, some without dot eyes. And I think if you've watched the series, you'll recognize a lot of these day players. Because Mercury adapted them into the final character designs. So this is our cast of incidentals. These are all people that you'll see in the background. If you pick one and you really look for them, you'll see that they probably show up a little more than than they might realistically in the world, because you can only have so many characters in an animated world. Can you talk a little bit about kind of what that design process was like with Mercury once you got into the episodic work of, hey, here's a new creature, here's a new character, and I'll just flip through some fun sketch to final designs.
Yeah, well, the process for me was fairly straightforward. Like I kind of picked out certain designs that I wanted, either felt strongly that I wanted to have a go at, or if I already had something strongly in mind, I kind of bagsied it. And then when the time came, yeah, I did some explorations. Sometimes they were kind of quite singular, like I think it should look like this. And sometimes I presented quite a few options, I think. And I basically, yeah, they got passed along to Mercury. And then someone at Mercury interpreted that and usually brought some new elements to it as well at that point. And then there was a bit of back and forth, a few rounds of notes until it kind of landed on the final thing. Yeah, so I think for the Mara, like, well, I'll say this, like, I remember one of the things very early on with the Mara was that they were originally written as like she was written as like a full-on goth kid. And that was, I remember that being like the first thing in the show that I really kind of came up against as something I wasn't like on board with, because it wasn't anyone's intention. I don't know if anyone else would have seen it this way, but I felt like there was a feeling in the script that if the Mara was this kind of goth and Hilda kind of singles her out for being weird, I felt it was an element, as someone who was not a goth but was somewhat aligned with goths as a kid. Didn't like the idea of like Hilda being someone who would like pick on the weirdo kids. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, she's not captain of the football team. She's somebody who sees subcultures or marginalized folks and wants to connect with them rather than think that they're ghosts.
No. So I tried to make, so my pitch for like the Mara's design was to make her more generally a teenager, whatever that means. But that was the general angle. Like she's a scary teenager. And one of the one of the differences here as well. I think I was like pitching the idea that when the Mara goes into like full scary form, she would kind of fully transform into something else. Like these are all quite a bit weirder than what they ended up being in the woods. But I think the final, yeah, there you can see she's like kind of, she's just a kind of creepy shape. Um,
And
but
we're
I think conceptually it's like cleaner for them to just keep their kind of scary teenage girl forms rather than being full-on monsters.
absolutely. And we're jumping around a bit, but I'll say Mara is a great example of a character that was not in the books, but came out of the writing process where we kind of did some research into kind of folklore texts that you had read, Luke, and that inspired you for elements of Hilda's universe. This book by Craigie Williams, or sorry, William A. Craigie. Craigie Williams is the name of the character in the series. Was one of this. I think this is the one that the Mara came out of, where these are like these old Scandinavian folk tales that are kind of like at the intersection of like, you know, folklore and like, you know, like remnants of kind of pagan religion, and there's all this like this melting pot of like stuff and like kind of the winter fear in the middle of the night that come together as part of these things. So the Tide Mice, the Mara, these are characters that over the course of writing the first season came up as, hey, there's like a really interesting story angle here, and usually it's where these these are notes from our first meeting. Um, you know, I'm trying to find. Usually it's where the folklore story there's some character angle for Hilda. So Mara, it's a story about fear, and Hilda's a fearless character, and that seemed like a really rich fulcrum for a story. Tide mice, which are these cute little mice that grant good luck to the person they're enchanted by. That's a story about desire and a story about kind of like wanting. To enchant your way to success, which also felt like a very rich story for Hilda. So, can you talk a little bit about what the role of folklore and of research was in generating those first season stories?
Well, I mean that's always been there from the start. Obviously, that book you picked out was one that I was reading before I did any of the comics, and various, well, the Woodman quite specifically came from a story from in there, and yeah, well, every element in the comics I did came from some folk tale to a degree. Well, that's not true, not every element, but a lot of certainly the elves, the giants, the trolls, the obvious stuff comes from there. And like when it came to doing the show, I basically like just shared all my resources with you and with Stephanie, pointing towards the books that I'd been looking at. And I mean, I think one of the jumping off points was you guys and Stephanie kind of just picking some things out there that you were interested in, and then we talked about them, and the stuff that kind of felt most appealing, we developed further. And a lot of it as well, it's like it's not so much just kind of picking a creature and just dropping it in, because you could quite easily go through an old book of folklore, find a weird creature, and just be like, all right, well, what happens if we just stick that creature in the real world? Then what? What happens if it's in the present day? But I like to think we try to come at it a bit more thoughtfully and try and keep the kind of the theme, or whatever the underlying route that story and those creatures is, if that makes sense.
And yeah, absolutely. And I'll say we tried to carry some of the details in too, because you read these stories and like they're so specific and like so like to the people who were telling them and the people who were gathering them felt so real that like some of these details are like too strange for us to even make up. Like things like the ghost wrestling in season 1, that's not something that we were like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if you had to wrestle the ghost? It's like that was pulled directly from like one of these folk tales that gives you instructions for how to raise the dead. It's like you got to wrestle that ghost or else he's going to come back and haunt you.
Yeah. Or another good example of that would be the cows in the Beecher tunnels, which I feel like, I mean, I can't even remember. I can't quite remember the story, but you would assume that was just a crazy random humor. But that came from the source,
Yeah,
material.
Vitra cows, and that's sort of something we took and ran with it. It's also a great example of a world that didn't exist in the books. Like the Vitra shows up really briefly in Black Hound, and we were like, oh, we love this little angry onion guy.
Yeah.
What happens if Hilda follows him underground? And so by creating a whole new world for an episode, Luke, you started by providing us sketches, and these are those early Vitra sketches. You see cows crossing here, you see a Vitra practicing a dance routine, but this gave Mercury like an early suggestion of what that world might look like. So we wrote the stories, and then we had to make them come to life. And a key piece of that process was casting voices, casting Hilda, David, Frida, Mum. Some key decisions in that process were using British voices for the main cast and casting actual kids as Hilda, David, and Frida rather than casting adults doing kids' voices as many cartoons do. Can you talk a little bit about those decisions and how we ended up there?
Well, I kind of remember some of the discussions about what accent she should have. You know, we sort of talked about, you know, where is this set? And in my mind, it is set somewhere in Scandinavia in a sort of alternate universe, but it's a sort of specific place. And I'm sure, I think there was some discussion of, well, in theory, she probably should have a Norwegian or Swedish accent. But it doesn't really make sense when it's an English language show, obviously. And so we kind of, I think settling on British, it felt like, on one hand, it felt like a little closer to that than an American voice would. It also felt more comfortable to me as well because I didn't really have a good idea of what Hilda or the cast should sound like. But I do hear them. I hear the way they say things. They say the things in a way, in an English kind of way, because that's how I'm writing it. So that felt more natural to me.
I'll add that, you know, if the show had lived maybe on a different network, there would have been more of a conversation about actually dubbing the show with American voices. But we're very happy that we have not, and I think the voices have traveled really well to territories outside of the UK because of the authenticity of the performance. And I would say that like so much of our cast, it was hard casting the show. We listened to many Hildas. We listened to actors that are now quite superstars to do reads for Hilda, and it was not until we heard Bella's first read that we were like, okay, this is Hilda. This is like everything about like the both the accent, quality of voice, but also just her like the raw emotional nature of her like the open-heartedness with which she approaches the character. And I would say the same for Amira and Frida, and like Oliver is David. I mean, it's so we really lucked out in casting the series. I think one other thing, and I think we also kind of tried to populate other accents. You know, the idea that this isn't literally the UK, but it's kind of like a city that is as diverse and as varied as like an international city might be. Um, I think we have a little bit of time left. I thought it might be interesting to go pick a scene and kind of go through each stage of the process. And I'm going to do it with a short clip from Hilda season 2. So this is like a bit of a sneak peek into Hilda season 2. And we can just kind of talk about kind of once we got into making the show, what journey the stories went on, right? So Hilda season 2 begins with elements adapted from Hilda in the Stone Forest. So let me just pull up let me just share screen. So Hilda in the Stone Forest, which is available now. Go read it if you haven't read it. There, in the opening pages, Hilda. Well, Luke, if you could tell us what's going on here.
Well, it opens up. She's chasing a an elf house, which the ground underneath an elf house has come to life and has run away with the house still on it, and the elf in question wants to be rescued, and Hilda is chasing after it to save the day.
So this beautifully illustrated and colored comic page.
I'll say as well, this I kind of I don't know if it was because I knew the show was on the cards at this point, or if it was because I felt I was more in that zone from doing a bit of storyboarding. But like the opening to this comic, I felt like I was trying to make it feel animated, and like it plays kind of like a storyboard. I think more so than some other sequences. So yeah.
Absolutely. So from here, we go to script, where we worked with Stephanie Simpson, who wrote this episode, who took elements of this book and crafted them into 22 minutes worth of television story. They don't cover the entire book because, the season takes a different shape than this book does. But here is an excerpt from that screenplay. Hilda and Twig chase the dirt clod over an old fence, down into the rail yards, into the train tracks, along the tracks under an archway in the Trollberg city wall. So here's that archway. So Mercury is now in a position where they have this comic page as visual reference. They have the script, so they know exactly what needs to happen for the television story. And then Luke, you mentioned storyboards. Can you talk a little bit about what that process is like?
The storyboard process is, I guess, like roughing out. It's like a rough version of what will be animated, but it's basically kind of defining the shots and the transitions and specific motions the characters are doing, but all in a kind of rough, kind of sketchy form that can then be timed to the audio, and it kind of prepares the animators, so the animators know what to animate, basically.
So I don't, I was just flipping through the thumbnails from your animation test. I don't have the storyboard for this episode, but what I do have is the animatic, which is the studio then takes that storyboard, and then what we've done kind of on the Silvergate side is we've recorded all the voices that we need at this point. So we've created something called a radio play, which quite literally is the episode in voices. And so the studio takes those voices and they take that storyboard and they put it together in something called an animatic or a Leica, which is really our first look at what the episode is meant to move and sound like. So I'll show you the Leica for this moment. I'll play that one more time. So you'll see even that last frame is very close to the last frame, Luke, from your comic. And so voices are in that, but all the sound effects, all the music, that's all temp. Because what we're going to go to next is the animation. So Luke, what's your so we look at the animatics, right? And what kind of things are you looking for in an animatic as you review?
I guess we're looking for which to see, looking to see how it works. I guess on one degree we're kind of looking to see if it's in line with what we felt was intended by the script, maybe. But I mean, from my point of view, I'm just watching it with an open mind, and just anything that comes to mind as something that doesn't add up or something that I feel like could be different in some way, and I'll just jot that down, and not without good reason. Like a lot of the time, the animatic will come, and it won't be what I was picturing from the script, but it's actually way better, obviously, because they know what they're doing. So yeah, I'm when I watch it, I'm just watching to see how it's looking, I guess.
And sometimes they come in and they're like minutes over length, and we have to figure out,
Sure.
we have to work with the director to figure out how to get all of the story into those 22 minutes. So then that animatic, once we all agree on what the shots are and how long they are, and it's to time, then the studio animates it, and they work with the artists and the animators to bring it into color. And once it goes away for a while, and then when we see it again, it looks something like this. So from those black and white rough sketches to just lovingly hand animated frame by frame, this is what we see. And then once you receive a first pass of animation, Luke, how does that feel when you get, oh hey, here's this scene from this comic that you had worked on what was probably many years ago at this point, seeing it moving in animation.
Yeah, it's exciting. It's I mean, this bit in particular was exciting just because it was so close to what I tried to do, and it was just kind of fun to see it kind of brought to life so accurately, especially even the cameo of Edward the Train from Thomas the Tank Engine. It's made it in there, which I was very pleased about.
It's those details we really do try whenever possible. We really do try to keep in, and I think the observant viewer will find like a lot of stuff. You know, if you watch it a couple of times, you'll notice little references to things as we go through. Sometimes we go too far and have to take them out for legal reasons. There are a few moments in season 2 where, you know, like I sadly had to bring the hammer down, but so again, this is still temp sound. So once we all, you know, the picture is locked and the animation in there and everything is moving and feeling the way we want it to, then we have to go and design all of the sound. And our sound designer looks at every single footfall of every time a character puts their foot down. He has to design what that sounds like, whether it's dirt. And I guess, Luke, can you talk a little bit about how um, how the series sounds musically, how the sound design is, and kind of what the philosophy was there in that first season, kind of arriving at what the show should sound like?
I mean, in terms of like the sound effects and stuff, like I remember there being discussions about should it be like like entirely kind of natural sounding, or should there be like a cartoony element? And I think we landed somewhere where, generally speaking, like it does feel quite natural, and it feel that the sound of Hilda's feet on the floor and the kind of the general kind of ambience feels pretty natural and real, like you can really be there. But then you got characters kind of like Alpha who kind of look and behave a little bit more like a cartoon character, and he kind of like brings, you know, there'll be little like swishes and boings because he's such a funny cartoony little guy. And yeah, I like and for the soundtrack, and I feel like you could probably talk through that more eloquently.
It was a long process that we worked together on, right? I mean, it was sort of like you start from, wow, what does this show sound like? And you kind of pull up a palette of musical influences and a playlist, and it's like, well, like there's a couple of different directions here. Like you could go, you know, there's an element of folk, there's an element of like, you know, of rural music, but like, do we go too far? It shouldn't sound like Mumford and Sons. It should have its own sonic identity. And I feel like part of like a big part of how we arrived there was working with Grimes on the opening title song and the inclusion of electric music and digital instruments and synthesizers that inspired Dan Mangan, who scored the first 4 episodes, really like define what that palette of instruments and sounds is. And then from there, it's just kind of like we worked with our other composer Ryan, and kind of yeah, it just kind of like kept kind of trying to push the format for each. We try to score these like they're little movies, right? You know, we don't have like soundtracks that we keep going back to. So we're always trying new sounds, from the Tide Mice episode, which has like kind of a crazy, like industrial metal Trent Reznor Atticus Ross sound to it. But you know, and oftentimes the temp music that we use in the animatics and in the first stage of animation influences the style and feel. So I'll play the final sound for this clip, and you'll get a sense for how it's all come together. All of these different collaborators building towards what is the final mix of sound and final picture. So even twigs, little sounds are added in that final stage. Um, so that's just one 7-second sequence, but over the course of a whole season, you get the sense for how many people participate in the process and how much kind of comes together to make this show. So Luke, we only have about 4 more minutes. How has it been working on this show, and has the show influenced your work as an artist? Has there been kind of a reverse influence on the comics and on the work that you do, having worked on this TV series?
I mean, truthfully, like as far as it's how it's affected me as an artist outside of the show, the last few years since becoming a father a couple of times, the show has been like that has been my work. So I have no idea how it's going to influence stuff going forward. Apart from, obviously, I drew. It did have there was some like interesting effects on the last Hilda book I did, Hilda and the Mountain King, which obviously I hadn't. That wasn't done when we started working on the show. In fact, I hadn't even finished Stone Forest when we started working on the show. And kind of writing. Yeah, we were like at an interesting point with that book where I was talking to kind of Stephanie and you guys about where I was kind of going to go with it, because the show is like pointing loosely in the direction of that was going in the comics, and I knew they were going to kind of build towards some version of that, but I hadn't started it yet, and I was there was some interesting kind of overlap in that. I was talking. I introduced a character in Mountain King who is like this troll hunter. That was the initial idea. This guy that Hilda kind of butts up against, and he only shows up in that book, but I was kind of talking to you guys when we were kind of pitching season 2, and it made sense to me that he should come into the story earlier, because when I was doing the book, it felt like I kind of wished I just hadn't come up with him in the previous story, but it kind of made sense that he maybe should have been there. So this character kind of got developed for TV and for the comic kind of simultaneously, and they're quite kind of like 2 different versions of the character, because I kind of tried to like stick to my initial version of him for the comic, while also like developing his kind of like his counterpart. And yeah, there was kind of some interesting push and pull there, including like Stephanie basically naming the character, which ended up being the character in, like, he's named that in the in the book. Like, I don't know what it would have been called otherwise. So yeah, the show certainly had like a big effect on that last book, even though I was, quite consciously also trying not to think of the show at the same time and just finishing what I started.
I think really rewarding for people who are reading the comics, and then are also watching the show. So I recommend everybody read the Hilda comics, all the way through to Hilda and the Mountain King. And then I think as you watch season 2 in December, you're going to see kind of all of the different ways that they're interacting, and kind of the story that they're building too. So Luke, anything you would like to leave the Thought Bubble listeners with before we sign off?
Nah.
Let's wish them health, and
certainly wish them health. Yeah, and I'm sorry that No, I'm glad I can't be a thought bubble right now, to be honest. Like, if there was a thought bubble,
we're in it. We're in the bubble right now.
we're in it.
So.
This is it. I hope everyone's well and happy and enjoying the virtual comic festival experience.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Luke. Thank you so much for your time and for your creative energy. We implore everybody to watch Hilda season 2 when it comes out in December. Release date to be determined still, but check out the Hilda Twitter and Instagram. That's where we'll be posting it, along with a link to the Hilda trailer as soon as it's available. We're so excited to share this season with you guys, and Luke, thank you again for your time. It's been a really exciting chat.
Thank you for your time.
All right, I will see you. Goodbye, everybody.
See you guys.